a lot of times these individuals don't even make it, they might not make it to the ER, or they only make it to the ER, but nothing else happens after that. So there's some studies that have looked at comparisons of emergency room visits, concussion education, diagnosis between white and black athletes. And they basically found that black athletes tend to not always have concussion education that has been given to them. Now, if they're like, if they play in school, like college and the university is required to give, but that also varies, because sometimes it could be a pamphlet and sometimes it can be a whole program. They also found that making it to the ER is significantly lower for Black athletes, and getting a diagnosis of concussion is significantly lower. So, for this area, that health care disparity is
Mhm.
significantly greater. It's not necessarily that Black people are more prone to TBIs, but in the NFL, because the black athletes make up over 58% of NFL teams, right? They're a major part of the population. The number of black athletes that get a concussion each season in the NFL is significantly high. Welcome to the Life, Language, and Lyrics podcast, where we explore finding our passions, living with purpose, and facing our fears. I'm Laina, and some of you may know me as Dr. D. I'm a professor, speech language pathologist, a baker, and a lover of people with a mission to bring a little Southern comfort to your day. This is the Neuro News edition of the podcast, which highlights stories and essential information about brain injuries with a focus on sports related concussions. The goal is to spread awareness and education on the effects of brain injuries and shine a light on the critical role of speech language pathologists and other professionals in recovery and support. I like to call them the Brain Injury Chronicles. Joining me today is Anna Williams. She is an expert in health disparities, and Anna has over 20 years of professional experience in sports medicine, human performance, and public health, and has worked in government, clinical, and academic sectors. She uses her background as a former professional athlete and performance coach to inform her work as a public health professional driving systems level health policy change. Thank you for joining me, Anna.
Thank you for having me, Lena. It's fun. It's a pleasure to be here. I love talking about all of these health disparities, but specifically concussion.
Okay, so Anna, again, thank you for being here. Now, I just read a little bit of your bio, but can you give your own version of a background of yourself? Where you from? What you like to do? All those kind of things.
So I'm originally from New York. I am, when I say New York, New Yorkers will ask the question, like, actually New York? So I'm from the Bronx,
Okay.
Southeast Bronx. And I lived there all the way to college. I left briefly for college, went back to New York for another 10 years where I worked as a professional. And then I moved from there to now I'm in Mid-Atlantic. And as far as additional background beyond what was in the bio, I know the bio mentioned being a former professional athlete. I think it's important to say that specifically what I played was tackle football, women's tackle football. I was a free
Mm-hmm.
safety. For any football fans, you're immediately aware of the fact that that means hits, right? Everyone thinks hits. That's exactly the type of safety I was.
Mm-hmm.
And I have all the same concussions playing tackle football, but also playing flag football from the women's Team USA national team to just recreational games. I have had concussions there too. So I've had more than five. I'm not going to get into the details of how many I've
Mm-hmm.
had. But so this is actually a personal interest, something that's very near and dear to my heart.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm gonna. Okay, and can I just ask you this about tackle football? How did you get interested in that?
Interestingly enough, I am the only girl and have four brothers. And one of the things my father felt was extremely important
Mm-hmm.
when we were young was taking an interest and an active, being active participants in some sort of physical activity or sport.
Mm-hmm.
So he asked us to pick our sport, and I picked tackle football. As a small girl, I mean, like elementary school age, I was dancing at the time, and I said, I'm gonna play tackle football, and he's like, there is no, there's no outlet for that as you get older.
Mm-hmm.
So pick something else. And so I picked basketball. It was a very New York City '90s thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I was good at it. I loved it. Um, but fast forward several years, I had an injury with basketball my freshman year of college, and eventually I was boxing. I was doing some boxing conditioning, and my dad called me one day and was like, "Hey, there's this women's national tackle football league,
Hmm.
and New York has a team, so you should look into it." And it turns out the tryouts were right after my birthday, which was a couple of days away, so I really didn't have a lot of time to prepare. But since I'd stayed in shape and I was doing strength conditioning and performance and everything, I went to the tryout, I made the team, and that was that. So you could say that I was always invested in playing. I just
Wow.
didn't have the opportunity until I was in my early 20s. So that's how I got started. And the call came from inside the house. My dad, who's a medical doctor by training and is aware of concussions, and that was something that he always talked to us about, but still felt empowered to call me his only girl and say, "Hey, go play tackle football." So I think it was a blessing to have that type of support.
I love that. On one hand, I feel like my dad would have loved that for me, and then on the other hand, I feel like he'd been like, I don't know,
Well,
but
it's funny you say that because he didn't let my brothers play. He
oh,
was adamant about the fact that the brain doesn't fully develop till 25.
mm-hmm,
And his thing, if you get through your freshman year and you've got certain grades, then we can talk about it. And of course, by that point, they'd picked other sports, so they're running track, they're playing volleyball, they're playing basketball. And it was kind of just like, well, maybe for varsity. And the argument was always, look at little dad, they pick the teams before report cards come out. And he did it on purpose. So, we have some jokes in the family around, letting your sons play. But my older brother, one of my older brothers will say, like, yeah, but will you let your daughter play? And my dad always has this look like, oh, here we go again. But so I can relate to what you're saying. But because I tried out days after my 25th birthday, I
mm-hmm,
think that was the other part of it. It's like, technically, I'm about 36 hours into 25 now.
yeah,
So I can go try out for
that
this
brain is developed.
sport. Yeah, yeah. So it's funny. Yeah,
I love that story. Okay.
it's wild.
All right. So we're here today. You're joining me so we can get into some brain injury chronicles. We're going to talk about really important issues surrounding health disparities. But to get into that, there's some stories that we wanted to share. And I like to talk about the fact that I think that it's important to share these stories. Now, the gentlemen we'll talk about today are still with us, which is a good thing. But for some of the other stories that are told here, they're not. And so I always try to come with these stories with as much respect and honor for the individuals that we're talking about as much as possible. So I just like to put that out there. And so today we're going to be talking about Najeh Davenport and Kevin Henry. Kevin is spelled Kevin, but it's pronounced Kevin. And we're going to lead into some other things. So I'll just kind of jump into these stories, and Anna, we're going to go back and forth as much as you like, okay? So starting with Najeh Davenport, we're going to go a little bit in his background. He is a former NFL running back, about 6'1", 247 pounds, big old guy. He was drafted in 2002 by the Green Bay Packers, and then he eventually played with the Pittsburgh Steelers, as well as the Indianapolis Colts. And he had an interesting nickname.
Hmm.
His nicknames were Dookie and Dump Truck.
Hmm.
And I'll go into a little bit about why that is. So, in April of 2002, just before he entered the NFL, he allegedly broke into a woman's dorm room at Barry University. And the report was that he left a little something in her laundry basket.
Hmm.
Um, it was a dump. pretty much. And so he did have a felony charge of second-degree burglary. I don't know if he actually took anything, and a misdemeanor count of criminal mischief. But he ended up only having to do like 100 hours of community service. Not sure if it was also because he was getting ready to be drafted or not. But he did continue to deny what happened and saying that he didn't do it, but that allegation gave him those nicknames that pretty much stuck with him.
So, so I'm going to interject
Okay.
because I think, you know, I think a lot of us have nicknames we don't always get or have or maintain control over where the nicknames go or
Mm-hmm.
how stick, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the things that come to mind when I'm like hearing this story, hearing you retell it, just for the sake of people who aren't familiar, this to me is a question that I think um, bears asking, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
where did this story break, right? Because it's allegedly he has denied it the whole time. This is right before he enters the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
Who who told this story, right? Whose
Right.
story, whose accusation is this? Because I'm sure he doesn't own it, right? It's not something that he
Right.
brought up accidentally and then had to deny it forever after. It's, to me, the question really is, who decided to tell this story? What were
Mm-hmm.
the circumstances around it coming out? Was there, because you said it was allegedly a woman's dorm room, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I have so many questions around the timing of the story, who told it,
Mm-hmm.
how it, because you said it was alleged, right?
Right.
He wasn't actually
He
convicted,
wasn't.
it sounds like. And it's interesting. I find it very interesting that, this is something that has followed him as a permanent nickname, even though he
Yeah.
has been very clear from the beginning that he never did this. So
Yeah.
that's just a question that I have, like,
Yeah.
whose story is this? Because
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and if you think about our community, we will we will pick a nickname based on something that a person does not like.
right,
Sometimes.
right. That's why I'm like, who did that? You know what I mean? Like, present day diaspora, it's me as a Black woman. Like, which one of y'all did this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's why I'm asking. Because
Yeah.
who you know better.
Exactly.
Like, that's kind of the feeling I get hearing it. It's like, that ain't right.
Yes. So Najeh spent 7 years in the NFL as a career running back. He retired at the age of 29. Um, and at when he was about 41 or somewhere in his early 40s, he started reporting episodes of memory loss, neurocognitive decline, depression, and he was even having challenges just doing household chores. And so, in terms of concussion, he reported that he sustained at least 10 while he was in his 7 NFL seasons. It may have been more than that, but that's what he was aware of. And even one of those concussions was a hit that was so hard that it broke the bones in his eye socket. Yeah, so, and he had to have surgery. And so, within that time, he did continue to do things like he got an advanced degree in education. He became a teacher, but he had to stop working because his memory loss started to become so significant. And at the same time, he also was having a hard time with controlling his temper. So he would have quick temper and then a lot of signs of depression. And so, even at some point, I think like 2007, he was charged with domestic violence. And that was with the mother of his son. About his son was about 5 at that time, and he was found not guilty on all the charges. I think the other ones were like endangering and unlawful restraint. um,
Mhm.
but we know, those of us who do focus on concussion, we know that concussion symptoms can include emotional behavior symptoms such as increased aggression. There's disinhibition, where you have a hard time holding yourself back from things that maybe you shouldn't say or do, and even being like irritable or more irritable. And so the other part about that is if you don't exactly know what's going on with you yet, you can have a harder time communicating what you're feeling or being able to express yourself. And so that's Najeh's story. I don't know if you had any.
Ask,
Mm-hmm.
uh, before we get further into it, just where where the background information is from New York Times articles, uh, an autobiography that maybe he's put together, like where, so that everyone knows like where we're pulling this information about him from, these
Yeah. So I
stories.
will put that information in the show notes. So now I do have some of it written down. I know I got one from Miami Herald. He also
Okay.
has done some interviews on I want to say ABC, but I'll document and cite the exact places where it comes from.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Kevin Henry played for the Pittsburgh Steelers as well. This is actually the third Pittsburgh Steelers story because the first one we did was on Mike Webster. So Kevin Henry also sustained a number of concussions, and he played with the Steelers for 8 years. He was released at about 33 years old, went home to Georgia. He fell into a deep depression for about 2 years. And then he eventually was able to get a job at Coca Cola, but he ended up leaving after about a year because the depression started to resurface and his temper began to escalate as well. And so he hadn't been able to work a full time job since. And so his wife has pretty much been the one that's been working while also trying to help to manage his mood swings, and he does have outbursts. And she was basically saying that like he can go from 0 to 10 like really quickly. So she had a lot of concerns. And for both of these guys, which is the reason that we're bringing them up, is they both went through neurological exams with the NFL's payout program. So the NFL had a concussion settlement where players were coming back after they had left the sport and they were saying, I got some stuff going on and it's because of football and y'all need to help us. And the NFL initially was like, we're not responsible. And after the settlement, it was like, no, y'all are responsible. But to get the payout, they had to qualify on testing. Henry, he took a neurological exam. The doctor concluded that he was impaired in three different areas: learning and memory. And I can't remember what it didn't list what the other one was, but they talked about learning and memory. But his claim was denied because they said incorrect normative scores were provided. So he goes and he takes a second. You want to say
Okay.
something?
Wait.
Uh huh.
So these incorrect normative scores, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
I should say incorrect normative scores, end quote. Um, I may be jumping ahead,
It's
but
okay.
I just would like to know who decided these were incorrect?
NFL.
The NFL. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so it's just blanket NFL. There's no division, no department. Okay. All right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So he goes and he takes a second exam, right? And now his doctor has adjusted his results using this special scale that we're going to talk about in a little bit that's specific to Black players. And his claim was denied again because this time the scores did not show that he had any impairment, which made him ineligible for payout. Okay. Now, Najeh Davenport, he took a neurological exam from an NFL approved doctor. And they found that his use of language and his executive functions, so all the problem solving, decision making, all those kind of things, his ability to manage his and regulate his mental processes were decreased enough to qualify for compensation. The doctor did not apply the special scale. So he received a letter that confirmed he was eligible for payout. And the NFL appealed that award and said that when his scores were recalculated, accounting for race, um, that he was not impaired in any category and ineligible for a payout.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I
Okay.
see you thinking.
Not because I have thoughts. Um,
Well, I think this is a great space for those thoughts.
so so you said it was an NFL approved physician, right? This is an NFL doctor
Mm-hmm.
that's evaluating. I'm going to jump to a wild conclusion here because I wasn't there and I don't know. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to jump to the conclusion that that physician knew he was black
Yeah.
when he evaluated, right? I'm just going to assume that this was in person. He was looking at him. He was talking to him. It's hard to hide your race
Mm-hmm.
if your skin color, right? I'm going to assume the physician knew he was black. I want to also assume that this physician was aware, because they're doing these evaluations, was aware that there were some separate scale or some norms or measures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't apply it and provided his diagnosis to the league. And then what it sounds like to me from this information is that league approved physicians do not know enough, are not qualified, are not trained well enough, even though they're appointed by the NFL, to outweigh a scale.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like
Mm-hmm.
there is more weight applied to some values on a scale that I don't know who made it. Maybe it was the same league physicians, right? But to be a trained physician that is hired to do these evaluations, and then after you do them and you provide a diagnosis, what you get back is, oh, actually, you're not as qualified as we told you you were. You're not as qualified as you actually are, or you are that qualified, but these numbers on this chart hold more weight than all your years of experience, training, research combined. Again, like I said, I'm jumping to conclusions here,
Yeah.
but that's what it sounds like to me. Like, oh, your table of values means more than this physician's experience and research.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that's fascinating. I find that to be fascinating. So,
Yeah. And I think your assumptions are my assumptions as well. These special scores are what we call race norms. And in some instances, they call them Heaton's norms. So there's a whole series of, well, I don't know if it's series, I think it's just a few articles where they took all of these like neurocognitive tests that have been existing, and also the neurocognitive tests that are used are very old and they're still used today. They're probably more than 20, 30 years old, and have to be because
okay,
we're in 2025 now. Very old.
right.
But
Well, so then they can't reflect if they're more than 20 years old. There's no way they're reflecting current research.
yeah, yeah, even for their own populations.
Right.
These
Okay.
tests were normed on primarily white men from the Midwest. Most cognitive tests are.
And so when you say cognitive test, and now, my background is not in
Mm-hmm.
psychology, and I'm not a neuroscientist,
Yeah.
but I I have looked into just some of the impressions and impact that exercise and physical activity have on cognition and cognitive retention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to my knowledge, a lot of what goes into testing is through conversation, through dialogue, through answering questions. Like, yes, there's some identification with imagery and whatnot. Um, but am I off base in assuming that some of this has to do with communication?
Say the last part again.
Like the testing, these cognitive tests, like there's a certain foundation of it or a certain amount of the testing that has to do with conversation and like verbal exchanges, no?
Yeah, there's some so more in speech language pathology we call that like discourse analysis, which can be
Okay.
very subjective, right? Because when
Mm,
you do that, there's not a true standard way to assess someone's like communicative competence in a sense. And so
right.
if the test giver has a very different communication style than the test taker, then their implicit biases or what they think to be correct for how communication should be expressed could become an issue. But there's also tasks, like there's tasks that are very like straightforward, like memory task and recall of numbers, digits, and things like that. Um, and let me see, I'm trying to see which way I want to go with this. So what I'll do is I'll talk about the race norms real quick, and that'll lead us
Okay.
in more into the assessment part. Because
Okay.
you ask good questions. And so the race norms, it's basically like these people who created this, they took all of the tests that already were existing, and then they got like a few hundred older black adults in the first round. So everybody was maybe like 50s and up, I believe. It was only like 200, somewhere between 240 to 250. And then
Okay.
based on how they performed on these tests, they created a set of norms. Um,
So can I
mhm.
interject again, or should I?
Yeah, no,
I can hold my questions
no, come
because
on with
I'm
it.
just wondering this 200 to 250 black people from where? Because at the beginning,
Exactly.
you added a touch of, I think you said Southern charm is what you try to bring to the podcast.
Hmm.
I'm from the,
Yeah, yeah,
so
exactly. Well,
where are these black people from? Because there's a lot of black people, and there's geographical
yep.
implications on like where we're from influences and impacts our culture. Like, yes, there's
Hmm.
some standard norms around cultural things where we can all relate to, like a head nod, for example, or some other pretty clear public indicators that, like, oh, okay, this person gets it. But when you say these 200, 250 people, the black people that they use to make norms, immediately I'm like, well, were they from Mississippi?
Hmm.
Because I don't know
Yep. Where
that
did they
I
come
like.
from?
I'm from New York. I don't. How do I know that
Exactly.
it makes sense to me and I'm black? So
Exactly.
anyway,
Exactly. And
I wonder, like, do they pay attention to that when
and
they're
can
picking
you
black?
base can you apply what you got from 200 people to a whole population?
Well, we are not internally, but externally looking in, we're a monolith.
Mm-hmm.
So you can take four black people
And say this
and
is how
apply
they
it
all
to
are.
all of us, right? This is what they all are.
Mm-hmm.
It's never been accurate, but 200, 250 is like we went above and beyond. So clearly, this is definitely representative of the entire group, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, I obviously say that with some sarcasm and I'm being facetious. But let me stop so you
No,
can
you
continue
good.
talking
It's
about
good.
this
I like the
race.
conversation. Yeah, and so, but that's the issue, right? The fact that you like automatically you like something don't sound right about that. Now, I'll be very honest with you. When I was just in the beginning of my PhD program, I didn't really know what that meant, and I had to do this assignment where I had to modify one of our tests. Um, and I was doing it for older black adults. And so I was like, I found this, it popped up, and I was like, oh my gosh, they have a whole set of norms for black people, right? And then and this is why I love Howard so much. Because I'm doing my presentation and I'm talking about how you can use these as a modification. And then the instructor, um, Dr. K Payne, she was like, okay, she was like, but tell me, why do we need this? And I was like, well, um, if these norm if the test wasn't designed for them, then these norms were based on. And she was like, but listen to what I'm asking you. She's like, why not modify the test? And I was like,
Right.
right,
Yeah.
why not modify the test? And so just kind of giving a little more information about the race norms is the reason that they are a problem is because one, they assume that black people function cognitively lower than white people. The
Hmm.
statement is actually written in that article. If you Google race norms now, those articles are not going to come up. All the negative things about race norms will come up now, which is a good thing. But it takes the scores that are the normative scores that are traditionally there, and it actually raises them up so that the idea is that it puts us on an even playing field. But one of the
Because
things
we automatically function at a lower cognitive level.
exactly, that's what they say. And
So
so
the
one of the things that I talk about, so I did an article that came out in 2023 about the challenges for the Black athlete and racial bias, and I talk about that fact of why aren't we looking at the test? Why aren't we looking at the way the questions are written, how they're designed? Because you, there's something that I love to talk about that's called cognitive learning styles, and it's basically the way we problem solve, and that comes into play a lot when we're test taking. And most of our tests, when we think about the GRE, the SAT, all the tests we take in school are very systematic. They're designed for people who think very analytically. But for the Black population, and it's not everybody because it's a spectrum, but we tend to be more holistic and intuitive, where we can solve this problem just as well as anybody else, but we do it a different way. And the tests typically don't allow us to do things in the way that we function the best.
Will we talk about examples of that, or am
I
I
can
okay?
give some. I can,
Okay, yeah, I feel like that would be
yeah,
helpful to sort of contextualize what you mean from, what you mean when you say like
the way
we'll
tests are
we'll
designed.
process.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, one of my favorite examples, and I teach this every year in my traumatic brain injury class. So, I have my students, I give them this, it's this one test in my profession that um, we found a lot of bias in. So, I tell people, I keep it for class purposes, but don't let me catch you using this one. And I'm gonna tell you, it's called the RIPA. A lot of clinicians don't really use that one anymore. It's the Ross
Okay.
Information Processing Assessment. And there's a particular subtest in there that's called the abstract language and problem solving section. Um,
Okay.
and one of the tasks in there, the direction says, I'm going to give you some scenarios and I want you to solve this as accurately as possible. And then one of the questions says, you're driving down the street and your car runs out of gas. What would you do? Now I'm going to ask you, Anna, if that was
Okay.
what you needed to do, if that was the directions I gave you, what would be your response?
This is me coming from,
Yeah,
I'm like, I'm trying to think like, is this, I just got out of a practice. Am I walking out of a classroom where I was talking about research methods? Like, which me is answering
I
this?
know. So
But
your answer
because that
might
was,
be slightly different, but either way it goes, it's
oh,
fine.
I run out of gas. I mean, honestly, I'm gonna call AAA. That's
Okay. So
like,
that's
why am I
perfect.
paying for it if I'm not gonna use it, right?
Exactly.
But it also depends on where, if I'm on the highway and I know, I'll remember some version of where the last gas station was that I passed, but it won't even matter if I don't have a container to put gas in to walk back to the car. And I'm a woman, so I'm like, I'm about to walk down the side of the highway. Like, yeah, I'm gonna call AAA. That's
Okay.
my
Okay.
final answer.
So on the RIPA, you would get so RIPA has a rating score of 1, 2, and 3. 3 is a correct score, 1 is incorrect. You would actually get a score of 2, and then they have these additions called diacritical marker, where like it gives a description like error, like repetition, they repeated, or it's a partial correct. So you would get a 2 partial correct for that response, because what the test really wants is for you to give them a 3-part response. It doesn't tell you that though. It wants you to give three
Right.
parts. It wants you to say, oh, if my car runs out of gas, I'm going to turn on my hazards. I'm going to pull over on the side of the road and then I'll call AAA.
But nowhere in the instructions does it say explain it to me like you're talking to a child.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because culturally,
Yes.
when we want that answer, we'll say, explain it to me like I'm 5.
Mm-hmm.
But
Exactly.
if a grown adult says you run out of gas, what are you doing? And I respond with call AAA, it assumes that I've already done all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
I've pulled over to the side of the road. My hazards are on. I have, like,
Yep.
So that's interesting. But okay, I'll take
Yeah.
it too.
So what you said was really key is that it assumes. And in Black communication styles, we do a lot of assuming in the way we communicate. We tend to
Mhm.
give the gist. We don't always give
Right,
all the details because we're like, it should be understood. Okay, if my car run out of gas, of course I'm gonna pull over on side the road. I don't need to tell you all that.
right.
Call AAA is a good response. And so when I did this research with my advisor at that time, and we looked at young adults who were Black and Hispanic and white, and what we found was that the white participants did give those three-part responses for the most part, and then the Black and Hispanic participants, they gave call AAA pretty much as the primary response. And these were
Mhm.
individuals who were non-brain injured. And so when we finished that scoring, most of them, almost all of them, came out looking like they had brain injury when they did not.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know what that makes me think of? Because I said at the beginning of the call that I've had concussions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what exercise physiologists like me
Yeah.
have had concussions, has had concussions. I haven't had any in recent years, but I'm getting a two. And now this is another place where in these tests, is it taking into consideration, is this, am I now supposed to assume like, oh, well, compared to your students who haven't had any brain injuries, like I know I have self-reported brain injuries, but I'm still getting the same grade as them.
Mm-hmm.
So there are, to me, it sounds like there's some additional flaws or discrepancies or challenges. And I know this test is one that isn't widely used anymore, hopefully not used at all. But it's just interesting because I think it shines a direct light on how nuanced testing cognitive function and impairment and traumatic brain injury impacts are,
Mm-hmm.
because call AAA is the standard correct answer, it
It's just,
appears, based on your test for Black and Hispanic test respondents.
mm-hmm.
So that's just my personal thoughts. But yeah, thank you for the example. That helps me as we continue. That helps me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. So it's all about like, if a person has a lot of implicit biases, then their tendency to score someone really low because they communicate differently, or even that they process the stimulus or the question very differently, is really high. See where we are. Okay, so I think we could probably kind of shift into so this is what I'll also say is one of the reasons that, actually, let me start here. So Najeh and Kevin ended up filing a lawsuit with the NFL because of this. They weren't the only ones who were experiencing this. And so I guess as more Black former NFL players started to communicate, they started realizing that they were not getting payouts whenever they had a diagnosis that was related to cognition or even dementia. And so what they were finding was that if they had diagnosis of dementia, they weren't really getting that much payouts as frequent as the ones who were diagnosed with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and Parkinson's disease. Something to consider about that is that the incidence of Parkinson's and ALS is significantly higher in whites than in Blacks. But African Americans, Black folks, tend to have the higher prevalence of Alzheimer's and some other types of dementia. And so that's where a lot of the issues started to really come out and come into play. And the NFL, they were they were denying that there were any biases happening. And what was also happening was that the physicians that were working with them started coming out and making comments that they basically were kind of being strong. I don't know what is that word?
Strong arm.
Strong arm, yeah. They were kind of being strong arm because the NFL is really powerful. In the last episode, when we talked about Mike Webster and Dr. Amalu coming out talking about CTE, like he dealt with
Right.
so much pushback and challenges and threats. And so a lot of the a few of the clinicians were like, some of them were saying that they felt regretful because basically like they knew they could have advocated better, but they didn't. Um, and they talked about knowing that it was discriminatory and that it was wrong. But I think that the way they were being like, I don't know if it was threats. I don't know any of those kind of things. But they definitely were starting to like backtrack and then come out. So they did end up having to do some retesting of some individuals. And I can't remember how many, I think it was about 85 or so that they ended up retesting. There were, I think, 34 ended up meeting the criteria to receive the payout. And of those 34, I think they were like doing some analysis to see what happened. When they did look at if they would have applied the race norms to them, only 10 of them would have qualified.
Hmm. Okay.
So it's an interesting thing. And my questions about that too, like one of the biggest things was what were they doing with the people who weren't black and weren't white? Like what if you were
Right.
Hispanic? What if you were Pacific Islander? What if you were mixed? What
Right.
what were they doing? I don't know.
And I wonder too if the data exists, if especially, when you talk about mixed race individuals or someone who checks other on the
Mm-hmm.
box, right? If it's under, are you then looking at education status? Are you because I'm not clear
Mm-hmm.
whether they ever looked at education status for the black athlete,
Mm-hmm.
and or if you're looking at family dynamic, social economic status. It does make me wonder, because I didn't really talk about my education, but I imagine that that would influence whether these norms make sense or not.
Mm-hmm.
Whether, I mean, a lot of things demonstrate that they don't make sense. But if I'm trying to apply them, I think you have a valid question. And I wonder
Yeah.
if that data exists, where that data exists. Um,
Yeah, I don't know if it does. I'd be interested to see that too. And I think the topic of level of education is really important because a lot of NFL players they have some level of college.
right.
Either they went for a couple of years or they finished their degree. Even a lot of the stories that I'll be sharing, quite a few of them went back to school and finished their degrees. But because really, your level of intelligence doesn't change, but the way you process becomes more challenging when you've experienced concussions, and especially repeated concussions like that. So yeah, it's such an interesting thing. And I think also I didn't say this, that this whole settlement was really just finalized in 2023, I believe.
Okay.
It came out I think 2021, and then I think it finalized 2023, so this was very recent.
And this is now with the 34 individuals, or are you just talking about even?
Yeah, Najeh and Kevin, that story
Okay.
came out in 2021.
Okay. So this is not the reevaluation that they did with the 85 athletes and
Yeah, I think that
34.
came in between that time. And then the
Okay.
NFL in 23, I think, is when the NFL was like, oh, we're not going to use race norms anymore.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other part of that, we talked about that we were going to get into talking about health disparities.
Hmm.
This is one of the ways that health disparities come into play. And I know this is your area. Do you mind sharing about what health disparities are?
Uh, I think if we're talking about like a formal definition, okay. And now I'm pulling this. This is just a list. It's not necessarily an actual specific definition, but this is from the Department of Health and Human Services website.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just use that. Um, it's it's basically non-discriminatory quality healthcare services. And generally, and this is, I find accurate, like there are barriers to access to healthcare services, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is, right? Whether the barriers are racial or ethnic, whether the barriers are geographical, if it's based on language, if it's due to or because of a disability, visible or invisible disability, because they exist, age-based, and of course there's gender-based disparities as well, which is not, that part was not HHS website,
Mm-hmm.
but so that's where I think the root of health disparities come from, access barriers, and whether the barriers are systemic, where they just have kind of been around because it was built this way originally, because certain ethnic groups either didn't have large enough numbers to be considered or had large enough numbers were intentionally rerouted somewhere else. Um, if there are perceptions around intellect based on English
Mm-hmm.
proficiency, and so disparities, if we're keeping it high level, and I prefer the HHS site approach because I feel like that informs so much of the conversation that we're having now, but also just the climate that we're in the larger conversations around disparities of inequities and equity as concepts. It's it's barrier and access, right, is
Mm-hmm.
what creates. So I think you had a separate question, a second question.
No, I think
Oh, okay.
that was it. Yeah. And this is a good example of how that can happen. Because and really, for when it comes to traumatic brain injury, mild TBI, concussion, we call it a silent injury because you can't
Mm-hmm.
see it. And you can't always pick up that somebody has experienced something unless it's like a population you work with all the time, right? So like I can sit with people sometimes and be like, there's
Mm-hmm.
something, and maybe it might come up. But when a lot of times these individuals don't even make it, they might not make it to the ER, or they only make it to the ER, but nothing else happens after that. So there's some studies that have looked at comparisons of emergency room visits, concussion education, diagnosis between white and black athletes. And they basically found that black athletes tend to not always have concussion education that has been given to them. Now, if they play in school, like college and the university is required to give, but that also varies because sometimes it could be a pamphlet and sometimes it can be a whole program.
Right.
They also found that their making it to the ER might not always is significantly lower for Black athletes, and getting a diagnosis of concussion is significantly lower. So for this area, that health care disparity is
Mm-hmm.
significantly greater. It's not necessarily that Black people are more prone to TBIs, but in the NFL, because the black athletes make up over 58% of NFL teams, right? They're a major part of the population. The number of black athletes that get a concussion each season in the NFL is significantly high. My lab right now is looking at that, and I cannot wait to put the numbers out there because it is just.
So now let me ask you, when
Mhm.
you say, you're looking at that now, are you also going to look into the players' positions?
Yep.
And then also, is this, and now if you're using current data, because I don't know, how familiar you are with the rulings and rule changes and whatnot, but there was a change to how kickoffs happened last
Mhm.
year that was implemented. And I wonder if you're talking about like series and like each down, like concussions that happened then versus concussions that maybe were happening during kickoff or kick returns. Because I think that also, and then, it's a lot of rules have changed to sort of decrease the incidence just with, intentional targeting and like leading with your helmet, spearing,
Mhm.
those sorts of. But I do wonder like where in play you're looking at, what types of plays it is, and then also positions. And you look like you were getting excited when I said positions. So let's talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that one might take a little longer because right now the only data we have is that somebody was identified as experiencing a concussion or a neck. We're also taking into consideration neck injuries because those can lead to concussion too. I think to figure out where in play, we probably have to do some runbacks of like the actual games because I
Okay.
don't have that access to that data. But we are looking at we're looking at their we're looking at the teams, the
Hmm.
positions, the age. Um, what else? What other factor did we have? We have race. That one is also a little bit tricky because we've been trying to do as much research to be accurate with the race and ethnicity.
Right.
Because you can't just look at somebody and tell.
Right. Right.
And then we also are looking at like who, like some of them like were out for weeks, but then some of them
Hmm.
were like back into practice or back in the game like fairly quickly. So we're kind of looking into all those different factors. But right now, like we just collected a lot of it and it's just for the past 5 years.
Okay.
Even just looking at it visually, the number of Black players, I think is still extremely high. It's still
Okay. Yeah. Well, when you're saying that, I'm also thinking about, you said you're looking at the teams, and naturally there's a group of physicians, right? There are team doctors
mm-hmm,
who are diagnosing the players, and I'm wondering how that plays in as well, right? On teams where there are less Black players getting diagnosed, are there less players, period? And then also, what is that group of physicians? What are their team norms around or thoughts around concussions, period? What if
mm-hmm,
there is a concussion diagnosed? Is there a delay in
mm-hmm.
the diagnosis becoming public, right? Versus some teams where like the numbers are higher,
Yeah.
but they're all, yeah, we did this the first test we did was right here on the sideline before we walked them into the tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of the game, the public knows, the announcers are sharing that, oh, we believe it's a concussion versus, 2 days later, a player is not on the active roster and
Mm-hmm.
testing is still being done. They still haven't said, we believe this player sustained a concussion. So I was
Yeah.
just thinking about that. And obviously that's data that would take, put even more time and hours and more of work into
Yeah, yeah,
collecting.
it would, and and
But
that's one of the limitations I think that there will be too is how accurate even is this data that is public. Um,
right. A physician that's paying attention to concussions, that's looking out for the health and longevity of their players,
mm-hmm,
is going to be more likely to call a spade, and call a
mm-hmm,
concussion and say no.
yeah,
You know, or in some cases we have with visual injuries, a fracture or some cartilage
mm-hmm,
that's out of place. So this idea of, we can acknowledge this injury is real because we can see it. It's showing up on film. We're going to inject something to make sure you don't feel it while you're playing and
mm-hmm,
or practicing. You get back out there. But with concussions, there's nothing to inject, and so it's kind of just like,
yeah, yeah,
we're not going to talk about it, and there's no need for a diagnosis because I can't, after the diagnosis, give you something to mask the symptoms.
that's a good point. That's a good point.
That
Um,
that's yeah.
I was at a conference where there was a former NFL player who's Black, and he was doing a talk on mental health, and I asked him, during your time, did you recognize any differences in the care you received being a Black athlete versus your white counterparts? And he was like, absolutely. He said he would notice that when the Black players would get hurt, they would go in that, like in that tent or whatever, and they would give them something. They would shoot them up, wrap them up, send them right back on out. But he noticed that the white players would stay back in the back a little bit longer or a lot longer. And so those were some things that, there's still, I think there's still a lot of implicit bias, racism. Um,
Yeah, and I don't even think that that's all that unique to the person that you asked,
mhm,
because what was it, maybe 3 seasons ago, anyone who wanted to watch Antonio Brown
mhm,
take his helmet off in Tampa Bay, and that whole scene where he's like, they knew it was, I think his foot was fractured or ankle
mhm,
or something.
mhm.
It was very clear. It was just like, I'm actually not going to play. And initially, a lot of the reporting was around how he's difficult.
Yeah.
It's like, you have an athlete, a star athlete, who contributes, who is
Mhm,
in pain
mhm.
with a diagnosed break,
Yep.
and he has to take it to this extreme, and then you have to talk about everything but his actual injury before
Yep.
that's prioritized enough to say, like, oh, why was he being told to just get back out there? And I think we know the answer. As you said, there's a
Mhm.
lot of implicit. There is this expectation that Black people don't feel pain or don't feel it the same way, and
Mhm.
we are exaggerating the pain that we feel when we report it to physicians, right?
Yep.
So, as someone who has never sat in an NFL tent, I can't say what that experience is like. But if I watch just some clips, a little sports center here growing up, and
Mhm.
a person here or there, and I do know, I'll say a number of players who played in the NFL who retired. Some of them have won Super Bowls. Some of them have gone to the Super Bowl and lost. And I'm sure I could ask any number of them questions and they'd be like, oh, absolutely. Like,
Mhm.
so to me, it's not it's not at all unclear or confusing as to why the person you ask would say, like, oh yeah, we get, wrapped up, taped up, and told get back out there.
Yeah.
There's no chance we're down the tunnel to get a more in-depth evaluation, right? We just get the tent and that's it, get back on the field. So I don't know what year that person played or what years,
Mhm.
but I'm sure it's implicit bias. I'm sure there are prejudices, because to me, on a player to player, player to position level, that's a very clear prejudice playing out. But then
Mhm.
there's the underlying racism in the system that
Yeah.
perpetuates. So
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Antonio Brown too. So around that time, I was so bothered. So whenever any NFL player does anything, that everybody's like, they have CTE. That's all you see in the comments.
right.
And you know,
And it doesn't matter that it's been made very clear you cannot diagnose CTE until the body has, that's it. You have to die.
yeah.
The brain has to be examined. You cannot diagnose it. And
Mm-hmm.
yet here I mean, we live in a world filled with opinions now that are all shareable and loud and
Yeah,
often wrong. So I'm not,
exactly. And
yeah,
I
I'm
did
sorry.
I did a series of posts around that time, and I titled them because I was doing my neuro news with Dr. D, and it was upcoming discussions confirmed and suspected CTE. Why we are concerned about Antonio Brown, because I will not place that label on somebody, and we don't know for sure. But I put in there that now we typically see the cases that are publicized, but the number of Black athletes in the media with negative behavioral psychosocial characteristics is much higher than other racial groups. Although we know there are concerns about concussion and CTE, Black athletes often receive more criticism than support until CTE is officially diagnosed when it's too late. Um,
Right.
and so I talked about a couple of other individuals, but I was like, we have to be careful about putting that note out there, and then to not even address what was really going on with him at that time. Now his personalities are different. He's a
Right.
different
Right.
personality, but to put that kind of label on somebody, I think is unfair to do also.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if that incident, right? And I'm not talking about the full AB career
Mm-hmm.
and everything, but that specific incident was like, you're working really hard to ignore the fact that you knew his foot was broken. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're doing all sorts of gymnastics to act like
Yeah.
that's not the main thing, and he's trying to keep the main thing, and it took a major escalation and walk off during the game, but
Exactly.
it's because you were doing all these gymnastics in the first place, you know. So I do, yeah. I think
Yeah.
how it manifests is different, but the fact that across the board, I think to what you read, the amount of the cases of the numbers of Black athletes who are reported as being whatever. I'll say extra because you know it's Black people, where it's really just how you're processing what we're going through and why how we're being perceived
Mm-hmm.
because you don't know what he communicated behind the scenes before it was a news headline.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so this bad media attention or injury that he is in pain,
Mm-hmm.
constantly found in pain, and anyone who's been in tremendous pain that you feel everywhere, whether you're standing, sitting, doesn't matter. And it takes that for people to acknowledge the fact that you're in pain. That's
Yeah.
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 So
Yes. And I think, man, if we could probably get on a lot more conversations about
yeah,
that
I'm
topic.
sorry.
Because I got a lot to say about that too, but we'll table
Let
it
me.
for
I
now.
will
We'll
stay
table it for
focused.
now.
I will stay focused. I promise.
Okay. So this has been so good. But we're shifting now into
Okay.
a part of the show that I really love. It's where I get to bring in my love of music. Um, and also I can learn a little bit about your musical taste as well. And for this one, we're going to relate it more to the topic of the episode. Um,
Okay.
and so, when thinking about the emotional weight of what we've talked about today, Anna, I would like to know if there is a song that you feel like captures that.
Emotional weight. I'm gonna go with "Cry."
Mm,
That is a Michael Jackson song,
okay.
and it's. I'm not gonna get into the song. I think it's worth listening to.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think it's a song that it's just the weight that when Michael Jackson's singing this, and this is later in his career. I think this is early 2000s. You know, he's basically talking about all of this pain, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
compound, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like there isn't just one thing that's causing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like layers and layers and layers, and that the layers in the song to me is what captures the emotional weight because there's a lot of layers with this issue, right? And it isn't something while we're talking specifically about concussions and payouts and trying to be corralled and categorized and boxed in with some nonsense norms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those same things are things that Black athletes and Black people, period, experience in other areas.
Yeah.
And so to me, the emotional weight of this is just it's the layers in that song "Cry" that I feel like they're running parallel.
Mm-hmm. I like that one. So I went Michael Jackson too. And
I mean, he's a great for no, he's a great for a reason.
he
So
really is. And so I did They Don't Really Care About Us. Um
mhm.
and it I mean it pretty much means what it says. But in
That's all
one
it is.
of the I don't think it's actually like a chorus, maybe like a bridge. But it says, "You can never break me, will me, thrill me. You can never kill me, Jew me, sue me. Everybody do me, kick me, kike me." I don't really know what that means. "Don't you black or white me." So it's like he's kind of acknowledging, like, yeah, some folks that don't really care, but I'm still gonna keep pushing and keep doing what I need to do anyway, which I think Kevin and Najeh, they did that by standing up for themselves.
Right.
And they created change that hopefully supports a whole bunch of former players who weren't getting what they needed and what they were supposed to get.
Well, I mean, they did create that change for former players, but I think what they also got the NFL to do was to say, "Hey,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to stop doing it this way."
Yeah.
So now the future players aren't going to have to jump through
All the
all of these
hoops.
hoops and
Mm-hmm.
get over all these hurdles after giving themselves to the league and to the public,
Yeah.
frankly,
Yeah.
for some of their most healthiest, most fit years, just to turn around 10 years later and be told like, oh, we don't care about all that time we spent screaming and yelling and eating
Mm-hmm.
popcorn and things, and for the owners going to the bank with the jersey sales, and that doesn't matter. Like, they've changed the trajectory and the outcomes for players that are currently playing now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think
Mm-hmm.
it's they're changing the paths or the outcomes for players who have already played, but they've created a new lane for current players, and I think and future players. I think that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right about that. Okay. Um, if you could send a message to the NFL through a song, what would it be?
I'm not gonna put the whole song.
Okay.
I'm just gonna the lines. There's two lines that that come to mind, and it's "I'm the living dead, the dark thoughts in your head." And I think as a message to the NFL, those two lines to me are very much clear. Like, it's clear to me, but as a larger us of me as a Black person, me as a former track football player, me as someone who has had concussions and is Black, it's clear that on some level the NFL did put thought into this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were conscious enough to say, let's create some separate race norms. Let's wait till a diagnosis comes out before we even mention this and see what the doctor says, and then we'll apply. We'll appeal and then apply these race norms to
Mm-hmm.
try and disqualify this person from a payout. And that, to me, like, I'm under your skin.
Mm-hmm.
If you know what I mean, because
Mm-hmm.
these are NFL positions, you can tell them up front, hey, make sure when you do this evaluation, you're applying these norms from the beginning.
Yeah.
But they don't. It's like a thing that's in their pocket, or this. It's a dark thought in their head that's like, oh, just in case, we've got this. We've got this waiting.
Mm-hmm.
This is our trump card. This is our joker. We're gonna
You're
we're
right.
gonna slam
That
this
is
on
how
the
it's
table.
used.
That's right. Like, here we go. Like, slam that on the table now, because we're not about to pay. And so
Mm-hmm.
I find that lyric, like, I'm the living dead, I'm the dark thoughts in your head, is like, oh, I'm here. And I know I'm here because of how you were using this and how you designed it. And that's what systemic racism is, right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
intentional timing
Yeah.
that is applied. And I think the fact that it's the living dead, living, that's an active verb. Like, it's ongoing.
Yeah.
And to me, call this me being a skeptic. I'm generally optimistic, and I am an optimist, but I'm a
Mm-hmm.
realist. And ongoing living means, if you said in 2023 you're not going to do this, you're not going to apply these norms, part of me is thinking, what will be applied?
Mm-hmm.
What
What will
is
be
the
the
new,
thing? Mm-hmm.
right? Like, what secret sauce have you cooked up now to sort of replace this and still undercut payouts, if any? Maybe you haven't, right?
Mm-hmm.
But experience tells me keep one eye open.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the lyric that to me stuck out. I was like, you know we exist. We do this on purpose, and it's calculated.
Yeah.
So,
I like that. I like that. And then my addition to that would be the song Karma by Queen Najeh. So I think the song is about like a relationship. It doesn't have to do
mhm.
with this kind of thing, but the line in there that says, and it's something we say all the time, remember what goes around comes around.
Right.
I'm not a judge or jury, but when you are systematically doing something to impact a group of people in a negative way, you know,
Hmm. Yeah.
something may be covered. And I guess the last thing I'll ask, and I don't know if I gave you this ahead of time, is there any type of quote or
Yes,
okay,
you did. You
okay.
did. So I am very rooted and grounded in my faith. I'm Christian, and I don't say that as like flippantly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just a Christian, whatever that means to you. I mean, I am actually a Christ-like person that
Mm-hmm.
believes in the entire message of unconditional love as the way Jesus walked the earth.
Yeah.
Christian. Um, and so I picked the scripture because I think it was an affirmation scripture or quote. So I picked the
Mm-hmm.
scripture. And I went with Romans 8:30. And it's basically like who he predestined, he also called, he also justified, who he justified, he also glorified, right? And the reason I chose that is because there is a lot that goes into reaching the level that Najeh even reached, right? They're just playing in the NFL
Mm-hmm.
and then playing the amount of time that they played and playing on the teams that they were on and then being in a position to retire and live, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to have loved ones communicate these challenges on their behalf sometimes and then to carry a mantle as heavy as what they carried and then to change the trajectory of the lives of the players who either played with them, played before them, or playing after them, have yet to get to the league. That to me is like that's them being justified and then winning the case is that glorification process. And I find that so much of the major weight that comes with changing cycles and redefining what a norm is and eliminating disparities through the change in laws or application or through just treatment and diagnosis. And I think that's a calling
Mm-hmm.
because that's not, you don't wake up, like, it's not like you're just walking, to the post office and back or, to the candy store, to meet a corner store. That's, that's a hill. That's a
Mm-hmm.
mountain you're climbing,
Mm-hmm.
you know? I don't know how much money the NFL makes a year, but billions of dollars, if
Mm-hmm.
not trillions,
Yeah.
billion dollar industry, and you're able to climb that mountain.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's Romans 8:30 all day, and that's a positive spin because I probably could have gone somewhere else, but yeah, I think God had a hand in that
Yeah.
because there are plenty of players. This is for these two specific. There are plenty of players who, you know, we see their story after they've taken the life of loved ones,
Mm-hmm.
and then life, and it's oh well, later we find out they did in fact have CTE. It's like, well, nothing we can do about it,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas these two gentlemen, God, I think God carried them through this.
Yeah.
So I don't see any other way to carry that type of responsibility, and that was a responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So that,
That's
that's my
beautiful.
scripture.
That was good. That was good. I like that take on there.
I'm a preacher's kid. Can you tell?
Yeah. Give us all the good stuff. Yeah, I love it. No, I think, but that's powerful though. It is powerful. Um, I went with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr.
Okay.
Out of all the forms of inequality, injustice is the most shocking and inhumane, and relating that to health disparities because the fact that it exists is just immoral and unethical. I've been talking a lot about that, and people, this story, at first I was like, it was a couple of years ago, but the more I tell it, the more I realize so many people didn't even know that it happened. Um, and so I keep telling it, even with, if you Google race norms, all of the negative aspects will come up. But I think there will still be some of those folks that will find one of those old articles and try to apply that, especially if people don't know this story or understand why they are not appropriate and why they are unethical to use. So I hope that the people that are watching or listening, whichever way you are engaging in the podcast, that you took a lot from this episode. I know Anna dropped a lot of gems in there, and I so appreciated the questions. Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, I mean, I have, like we said, we could have a whole nother conversation around some of the stuff. And so I still have things, in my mind spinning. Um, but I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna add them because I think we covered a lot. And I just want to say thank you for having me on your
Oh,
podcast. I'm
thank you for
grateful
coming. We
here.
might
This
need a part two, Anna.
by all means, just like a dialogue and a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I'm absolutely open to that.
So, would you like to share with people how they can find you or anything that you want to just put out there?
Um, well, so I didn't share this at the beginning, but I write.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a
We
lot
didn't
of
talk
it's
about your poetry.
and
Yes.
a lot of it right now is really focused on sports and relationships, like friendships that were spawned through sport participation.
Okay. But
I don't know.
the poetry is good, y'all. I got to see her last year on the main stage. Um,
I did perform, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not as I'm not necessarily a huge social media person. I think if you want to share my social media, you can. I just
okay, so I'll say one, I enjoyed this so much. I'm so glad that you gave some of your time today to engage in this conversation with me. And I hope that we are able to come back again and do another discussion. I think we got a lot more to talk about.
I do
Yeah.
too.
Okay,
Too.
so that's a wrap for this episode of Life, Language, and Lyrics. I hope you learned something new and feel compelled to spread awareness about brain health and brain injury. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow on YouTube, and you can find me on Instagram. Your support helps spread the word and keep these conversations going. Until next time, take care, stay inspired, and keep showing up for yourself. See y'all soon.